Happy to see so many of you here after this afternoon. I'm sure your minds are expanding and also maybe a little overwhelmed, so hopefully we can keep this a little bit lighter than I'm sure some of the sessions were today. Of course, we're going to have this as an interactive session, so I will be opening up for a big Q&A panel piece after, so keep your questions in mind. But if you have something that crops up while we're chatting, please just raise your hand. You know, we're in a small, intimate group here, so we can absolutely have this as a dialogue. So my name's Steph. I'm the founder of Green is New Black and the Conscious Festival, and it's my pleasure for this little session to be your moderator. Now, I'm going to introduce very briefly our panelists here. Well, actually, I'm going to have you guys introduce yourselves in 1 minute because I think that's always nicer to hear from your voices. But just a little bit about this panel. So this is really about inclusive finance. We want to be talking today with these leaders who are pioneering sustainable finance solutions and also working to make green finance more inclusive and impactful, and especially with a regional lens. So they're each going to be bringing their perspectives from venture capital, sustainable finance, and impact investing to offer us a unique set of views on this topic today. So, Paul, we'll start with you. If you could just give us a 1-minute introduction about yourself and how your work is related to today's topic of inclusive finance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. I know it's getting late in the day. So I'm Paul. I am a venture capitalist with a fund called the Radical Fund. We are a relatively new fund. We launched April of last year, and we focus on very early stage tech companies. So, you know, pre-seed to pre-A, meaning just, you know, we've invested in companies pre-revenue, sometimes just 1 or 2 co-founders, sometimes even pre-product launch. But our main focus is that we're looking for startups that are addressing climate impacts that are relevant to Southeast Asia. And I word it like that because, you know, we'll invest in almost any sector, fintech, healthcare, manufacturing, as long as a core part of their operation results in some sort of measurable, manageable, and ultimately monetizable climate impact, whether it's air quality, whether it's waste, whether it's, energy usage and efficiency and transition, whatever the case may be. That's the work. Aside from my work as a VC, I'm also pursuing my doctorate research, specifically doing research on closing gender funding gaps in Southeast Asian tech ecosystems, which is actually related to our fund mandate as well, and the work we're trying to do on inclusive climate finance.
Yeah, and we're going to be hearing about that in a little while. And also, I just love the name, the Radical Fund. When I first saw that, I was like, that is so brilliant. Great marketing.
I claim no credit. Alina, our CEO, takes all the credit for that.
Yeah. Kristina?
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So hi, I'm Kristina. I am currently working with several NGOs and IGOs advising on sustainable finance topics. Just previously, I was almost half a decade with WWF, based here in Singapore, where I headed the Asia Sustainable Finance team, and we basically looked at the finance sector very holistically from the regulatory perspective through banking, investment, and training on ESG topics to see how can we actually build in and integrate ESG into decision making, but also come up with the solutions and the vehicles and products that we need to finance and create the new green economy. Besides this, I also I'm sort of in the same space as Paul because I'm an angel investor. I mostly have looked historically on the fintech side, so looking at payments, banking the unbanked, but more and more dipping toes into the climate tech space as well. So pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Holly.
Yeah, okay, great. So hi, I'm Holly. I work in the impact investing space, usually for fintech startups that are trying to democratize impact investing. So creating solutions for retail investors, or those solutions specifically being to democratize on the other end. So making sure that funds are getting to enterprises that don't necessarily fit into the VC model or want to move out of just philanthropic dependencies. And I am a non-conventional person. I am an activist every single day of my life, and that is why I work in fintech startups that are trying to challenge the status quo.
Yes, we have to move the money, and that is what today is all about. And everyone keeps talking about this COP this year and how it's all about the money, because climate finance is really at the heart of this year's summit. And they really want to, secure trillions of dollars from the affluent countries and move that away from fossil fuels and, move it into developing countries. So I have a quote here that I got from Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, who said, at COP, I guess it must have been yesterday, climate finance is not a charity, it is an investment. Climate action is not optional, it is imperative. And on climate finance, the world must pay up or humanity will pay the price, end quote. And I think this really just summarizes exactly how critical and important moving the money is and why we're all here today to talk about it. So, Kristina, I would like to start with you just to talk and understand a little bit about the efficacy of COP. What is the role that it's really playing in advancing green finance and mobilizing sustainable investments, particularly in the region? Is it effective? Is it not? Let's start there.
Steph, and maybe just to kind of lay the ground, who's been at COP before and who is actually in the finance sector or related to the finance sector here? Okay, great. Just to kind of know, how in depth to go. So maybe we should take a step back and maybe we can break this question down, because I think it's very important to break it down to understand the nuances, right? Because the last couple of days we've seen various criticisms around different issues with specifically this COP this year, and it's more nuanced than that. So just to look at actually what is COP, right? It's the ultimate decision-making body for the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And for now, the UNFCCC is the only global multilateral framework that is there serving for climate negotiations. So if we look at kind of the timeline since COP originated, not many people know, but the first COP was in Berlin in 1995. So that's 29 years ago. And through this timeline, if you look at kind of the major developments that come out of these meetings, we can note in 97 the Kyoto Protocol and the Carbon Development Mechanism that came out, which kind of laid the foundation of the carbon credits markets. We think of some others, for example, Doha, not very famous in 2013, but that's where the Loss and Damage Fund idea came to light. And then, of course, we know the 2015 Paris Agreement COP, right? And I think I'm giving this context because we can see there are different dips and there are certain spaces between the COPs at which there are significant outcomes on climate action. So that's important to note, because if we think about the efficacy of COP up to 2015 and the Paris Agreement, we can definitely say, yes, it's effective, because we had a global agreement on setting a target, climate target, and then legally requiring countries to explicitly set NDCs and report on these NDCs every 5 years. Now, where this gets nuanced and kind of takes a little bit of a turn is when we look at how that Paris Agreement is structured and basically the implementation post-COPs. So I think the second phase of this discussion. So first we were looking at the background. Now we're going to look at this COP in particular to see how effective COP still is. And a lot of the criticism is tied to a few things. So one, we've heard about, of course, another oil state this year hosting these negotiations. And also, I think the more serious concern has been related to human rights interventions from the Azerbaijani government, as well as of course, censorship and so on. And why this has been important, of course, not only on the human rights perspective, but how this is relevant to COP, is it's limited a lot of the voices of civil society and the activists that need to be there. So if the right people are not going to COP, then obviously the scales are going to tip in the direction of the people that are actually there, the lobbyists for certain sectors that we were looking to transition out of. And that's why this is extremely important. And I think one aspect here is how the UNFCCC is actually setting the agreements with the host countries. And in this agreement with Azerbaijan, there has been criticism that there's been a lot of ambiguity around human rights protections. And this is where, again, we need those safeguards to come back for the following years in order to ensure that we have the right people there. And also another aspect has been representation. We've seen, I think, in some of the Singapore groups this morning, people criticizing, why should I care about climate if the top states in the world and the top emitters are not being at COP? Now, we can talk and go in circles around this, but I think, and this is another kind of discussion related to politics, which we won't go in today, but how this is all related to finance, maybe just to bring it back down to that, is, I guess it's early to say, we're only in the first couple of days. We've had a good foundation, so we see a coalition of MDBs or development banks coming together and committing 120 billion by 2030, which people say, yes, is a good number because it's 60% higher than what we committed before. That's a foundation, so we can look at it in many ways. The World Bank in 2020 estimated that we need 5 to 7 trillion per year to meet the SDGs by 2030. That doesn't mean that's only public finance from MDBs. So we can take this 120 billion and say, okay, it's one step forward to be able to enable more capital for the private sector to meet these goals. But again, it's a foundation. The other very important thing for the region, and the MDBs and the public finance is important for the region because this is related to a lot of the conservation efforts here, the nature-based solutions that we have that are very critical for this Southeast Asia in particular, and I would argue Asia-Pacific as a whole. And then the other important point, I promise I'm wrapping up soon, is the agreement on a framework for carbon markets. And again, this is extremely important because this is an opportunity to trickle a lot of money, again, into nature-based solutions that can help the region tremendously. So whether COP is still effective or not, I think up to the Paris Agreement, we can say it was. From here to 2030, we need to see if this trend continues that exists in the last maybe 2 years, then we can really argue and I think affect more pressure on the effectiveness. But I think towards 2030, we'll be able to make that judgment call, and hopefully we will come at the conclusion that it is effective.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving us the background and also just, unpacking what we're facing and what is hopefully going to be coming out of this COP. I did want to just zoom in a little bit on the loss and damage mechanism particularly, because I know there was big commitments from developed countries to jointly mobilize over 100 billion by 2020, and we haven't really seen anything close to that. But I did, hear today that at the Singapore Pavilion, Ravi Menon announced Singapore's pledge to match up to USD 500 million for green and transition projects in Asia, which I thought was maybe a bit of positive news, and that the dollar for dollar initiative aims to eventually raise over 5 billion US with international partners to make climate action a little bit more viable in the region. So would love for you to just talk a little bit more about the loss and damage mechanism and what we're seeing in the region.
On this. I think loss and damage where we're at now is the money, of course, coming into that fund is very important. But again, the structure and the mechanism and how this fund will be deployed is important. And I think later we can talk about, maybe go into mechanisms and different products, but that's where the detail is. Because even if we have the money to unlock those finances and distribute them and ensure that the countries are ready and have the structures nationally to absorb this money is a different story. So we can maybe go into that later.
Absolutely, thank you. Paul, let's pop over to you now. So venture capital is sort of, the lens that we're going to be asking for this next question about, because it really does prioritize returns first and foremost. But I know, you've also, when you look at things, you do look at the ESG and the climate considerations. But I am curious, everyone keeps talking about how there's a dip in funding. I even saw graphs today earlier, which if I had more time, I would have asked to put on the screen. But really we're seeing a lot less funding in general, and especially a big drop in the climate space. So what is your sort of sentiment about what's happening in this space, and how important are ESG and climate considerations in venture funding right now?
Okay, wow, that's a bit of a meaty question. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying that all the thoughts I'm going to share are applicable up until the impending change in administration in the US. Because in the VC space, yes, there's been a general retrenchment in the VC space. It's been harder for VC funds to raise money, And so in turn, they've been a little bit more cautious in deploying capital. That said, through 2022 and 2023, even though all sectors saw a retrenchment and less VC dollars going into startups, there was less of a retrenchment in the climate space than in almost any other sector. So every sector took a hit. Climate took a relatively softer hit. Wasn't great, but it was better. So the net effect is that the share of VC dollars going into climate actually increased. Not because more money went in, but because less money flowed out relative to others. And then, so as a result, I think in 2023 and in the US, we saw approximately 1 in every 4 or 5, about 20-25% of VC dollars went into either something quote unquote climate tech or a startup that was addressing climate problems. And that was up from, I think, probably about 15-16% the year before. Southeast Asia, very similar story. Retrenchment across the board, but less in climate than in other sectors. So we actually saw climate as a percentage share of VC investment go from about 7.8% to about 9.5%. So just under 10%. Now, the whole question is, with the new administration coming in, with the potential for Trump to pull out of, Paris Agreement for a second time, potential unraveling of the, Inflation Reduction Act, it is a big question mark on the state of where climate is. And so there's a lot of talk in, the venture financing space that, we might need to look to places like, say, Europe or China to take climate investment leadership. Because I think those markets have actually been quite bold in climate. Definitely the Inflation Reduction Act sort of raised the game for everyone. And hopefully the U.S. doesn't retrench, but if they do, the other players will still step up. So that is kind of the big question, is are we going to continue to see a bit of a decrease? That said, I think the one thing to keep in mind about climate, because if you look at every other hot sector that kind of goes through a bit of a wave, so whether it's crypto or whether it's generative AI, a lot of attention, a lot of hype, a lot of interest, very sexy industries. But those are industries where if a lot of those companies fail to deliver on promises, the default is life as is. So if crypto doesn't take off, 99% of the world or more still uses fiat. If we don't use AI to process our loan applications, then we still have loan officers. The problem is if we don't fund climate problems don't go away. They don't hold steady. It's business as usual, because business as usual is just a lot worse all around. So the one thing that I've always appreciated about capitalists is that people who are greedy about making money will always look for big problems that are monetizable. So I don't think climate goes away in the next few years. I do always feel that we're going to see private equity and venture capital money find ways to carve out a space. And I think what's really quite interesting as well, and I don't want to drone on too much, is that I think a lot of worry has been around, okay, are we going to see a reduction in technologies and renewables? Are we going to see a reduction in technology around, decarbonization technology? And that basically means that thinking is focused on the area of climate mitigation, which is about 95% of all investment into climate. The really big unspoken need is on the adaptation side, which only gets about 5 to 10%. Once you start looking at adaptation, then every industry is up for grabs. Can we do funding platforms in the fintech space to match green lenders with those that are doing solar installation? Can we look at companies in the medical and healthcare space that's trying to find ways to reduce the impact of medical waste? Same thing for food waste, excess inventory in the fashion space. So now we're no longer limited to just a handful of very tech-oriented sectors, but we can literally look at e-commerce. We can look at the food and beverage sector. We can look at smart buildings like the building that we're in now. And what's really important as we start thinking about inclusive climate is it's hard to see how directly inclusive is if you have a huge farm that's basically extracting carbon from the atmosphere. There's an indirect benefit. But when you're doing something where it's adaptation, like we're trying to clean up our canals from plastic waste, or we're trying to improve air pollution, which tends to affect lower socioeconomic areas, climate adaptation has a much more direct linkage to serving underserved communities, that inclusive part of the mission. So for me, I'm still cautiously optimistic that going forward, if I'm not limited to just renewables and solar and EVs, but I can look at e-commerce and fintech and healthcare and just look for that climate angle, then we're still plowing money into climate and we still get to serve that inclusive mission.
So that's really interesting. And so I just want to understand one point in particular. You said it was like 5 to 10% is currently being of the investment pool in climate is going into adaptation. Do you see that will grow and shift? And educated guess, obviously, I'm not going to hold you to your numbers, but what do you think what that shift might look like in the next 5 to 10 years? And so are you also saying that you really do see that there's a lot of opportunity for actual returns by focusing on those few examples and interesting
Absolutely.
things?
I mean, and I think it has to. I mean, I get why the majority of investment goes into mitigation, because if the patient just had their limb severed, you stop the bleeding first. You don't worry about prosthetics. You don't worry about quality of life. You have to at some point. But right now, you're just trying to save the patient. That's the same thing. We need to figure out how to stop ejecting greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. But that doesn't mean that as we're doing that people aren't going to start suffering from a greater incidence of 40-degree wet bulb days, or droughts, or flooding, or their children swimming in the local canal where there's nothing but plastic. We have to fix those problems. It's just not as top of mind because they're more chronic than they are acute. So it's something where these are threats that will kill over a longer period of time, rather than a wildfire that is quite quick and quite rapid. But we eventually need to start thinking about how do we solve these problems. And so we have a number of funds around Southeast Asia. A lot of the climate funds in Southeast Asia are looking at climate adaptation missions. The Radical Fund is purposely looking at a 50-50 split. So still trying to figure out how to get to net zero emissions, but also trying to figure out what to do in the aftermath. And so I think, and it's unavoidable, because if you let a lot of these problems slide, if we don't do anything about it, then obviously our heating bills go up, or our energy bills go up, because we're now using a lot more air conditioning. Air quality gets bad, so our healthcare premiums go up. Across the board, there's always going to be some sort of impact that some entrepreneur out there is going to try and solve for.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. Holly, over to you now. We'd like to unpack a little bit about the impact investing lens and how you're sort of seeing this in the region, but also I was interested because when we were doing the prep call, you were talking about how a lot of startups in the climate space really get confronted with this valley of death in funding. So how do you think that the financial sector can better support these early stage ventures?
Okay, yeah, great. So the thing that I care about most is accessibility, and I've always cared about that in different realms of my life. In this respect, when we're thinking about the climate solutions in the world, and specifically in this region, they don't look like the climate tech Silicon Valley bros, right? They're not the typical Western idea of what it means to solve climate change, and don't necessarily have this startup want to get 10x return in the next 3 years or whatever. They don't care about that. They're not necessarily trying to be the next conglomerate. They're solving real problems in their community. And they didn't start their business necessarily to make loads of money. They started their business because there's a problem and they have a very local solution. So when you have companies like this, or enterprises, or even just community initiatives, how do we give funding to them? How do we invest, loan, grant that isn't the typical VC? And that's the thing we need to think about. So
LendforGood, who I forgot to mention earlier, sorry to my bosses, is a crowd lending platform. So that's like one example where enterprises come, they need bridging finance. Maybe there was a flood and they lost all of their grain stock for that year. And now they're in a very real situation where they need just something to tie them over. They don't need investment, losing, giving away shares in their company. They're not needing some kind of like mentorship scheme. They literally just need a bit of capital just for a short time. There are situations where there are amazing enterprises or initiatives that rely on philanthropic grants. But when the grant dries up, they've got to do it again. They've got to go searching for funds again. And actually running things more on a loan business or trying to turn things into enterprise style is better. But again, they don't fit the mold for VCs because they're not trying to excel in this way. That's what needs to change in finance. And sometimes this is not what private equity really wants to look at. And they're trying to meet particular financial requirements from their clients. Impact lending or impact investing, impact investing, let's start there, is investing with the intention to make money and make a difference. And so enterprises or businesses that come under that have got to have an impact first business model. It's got to be a business model, it's got to be making a difference. And more allocation needs to be put towards impact investing. It could be a foundation that allocates a portion of their money to these kinds of investment vehicles, or it can just be like everyday people. The point is that these vehicles need to actually meet the needs of the enterprises themselves when it comes to money. There was one more point at the end of your question. What was your wording? There was one more point I thought about that was valuable there, but it's just left me.
I don't remember. I asked a lot of things at once. I know
Yeah,
I
you
tend
did.
to do that.
Sorry.
I get excited with my question.
Yeah. Oh, I remember it. Okay, so the first point I wanted to make was that the money needs to look different. The second point I wanted to make is the expectations of businesses in order to access capital has to be different. So as an impact investor, if I am investing in publicly listed companies, my expectations from them is far higher. If you're a publicly listed company, you got money. I want to see full sustainability reports. I want to see you complying with your local and international regulations. I want to see proper frameworks. And I know what frameworks I'm looking for. I used to analyze them. So I've got different expectations. But in terms of the impact that those companies are making, I know it's going to be not as direct. I'm not expecting them to be changing things on the ground because they've managed to make it that big. I'm expecting more infrastructural impact. But if it's a micro or SME, I'm not expecting the same 40-page sustainability report with my impact management and measurement hat on. I'm not expecting theories of change. I want to see storytelling. I want to see qualitative impact reporting. I want to know whose life did you change? What was her name? How did she now manage to feed her family because of this community initiative in Cambodia? That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. And in finance, when deploying funds, a VC can't ask for number of lives changed because they might not collect that data, or actually the numbers are catalytic. How can you quantify something like that depending on the impact enterprise? So that's my second point, is that expectations have to change. You can't ask a micro entrepreneur for a theory of change. They're just serving their community. They're just running a business. Those are my 2 points.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing. So let's unpack that a little bit again. You talked obviously about the grants and everything. So Kristina, over to you, because green finance has traditionally relied on grants and public funding. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what some of the new financial instruments or models you're seeing, some of the other mechanisms that are really, happening in this region for inclusive green finance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is true that green finance started off through philanthropic support, through public funding and government subsidies. But I think for the past decade now, we've seen different instruments arise. Now, the uptake and the growth of these instruments is another question, right? So the players that we see that are coming in from the private sector are, of course, your institutional investors that in kind of the parts of the world that have developed sustainability expectations, we see institutional investors kind of being pushed and required to get into this space, right? So these are your pension funds, your insurance companies. Then we see the likes of corporates and the banks that support them to issue things like green debt instruments. And then we have your private equity, venture capital, and so on that look at your more kind of risky types of things. So to those instruments, actually, there's the different instruments that we have at the moment are diverse, and they're designed in a way that cater to different types of projects. So absolutely echo what Holly just said, right? So you have your big corporations that work with banks to issue bonds. So you have your green bonds, your sustainability-linked social, etc., your GSS so-called bond universe. And they're tailored to specifically support types of projects that align with different standards for that instrument. Then, of course, you have your equity investments, whether it's in, again, sustainable companies or the more kind of early stage initiatives. And then we have, of course, carbon markets, which I mentioned, which is another form or another platform that is hopefully will be extremely useful to facilitate inclusive green finance. And again, just mentioning this development of COP aligned with the Article 6.4 from the Paris Agreement on carbon markets, this is extremely essential because, again, carbon markets facilitate not only carbon reductions, but they do facilitate funds to emerging markets in developing countries exactly in the form of nature-based solutions. And then this is carbon markets and also blended finance. And blended finance is not a new term, but it's something that I think Singapore in particular and other parts of the world are really putting an effort into cracking down. And again, why? Because nature-based solutions, so different projects like, for example, forest conservations and restoration, wetlands, mangroves, nature-based infrastructure, using nature instead of building gray infrastructure. These are all risky investments, right? This is not your typical project that will be financed by a bond. So to be able to basically execute or get capital for these types of projects, you need different types of finance flows from different players, financial players coming in at different points in time to accept the risk of the project as it develops. And to Holly's point, right, where we have nature-based solutions and really small projects on the ground, where you have projects that are worth 1 or 2 million or even less, right? I recently had a conversation with someone in Fiji and with UNDP actually, and they were saying, well, we have a problem in Fiji because it's very small, and the biggest project that we have is a waste and pollution facility that they're building, which is below 2 million. Most of the other projects are related to ensuring that people on the ground can keep their fishes in a solar-powered refrigerator. Now, I can't recall at the moment what the population of Fiji is, but that's definitely going to be a very small ticket size project. So how do you actually get a big investor to come into this, right, and to recognize the potential? So this is where, again, aggregating different types of finance can play a role. But what I do want to mention here, and related to the developments of COP, is that this green finance, how we structure it, it's not only the structures and the products that are important. And again, we do need a toolbox of these to scale inclusive green finance, but we also need the policy behind. And again, relating to the UAE COP28 developments and why the inclusion of CCUS or carbon capture and utilization and storage technology, why that was debated to a large extent. It's not only because there's a risk for over-reliance in these technologies, which might not end up working and then we cook the planet. But it's also because if you think about it, yes, putting venture capital or blended finance in these types of technologies could be considered inclusive green finance. But who can afford these technologies, right? If you look at who is developing now, it's European countries and the US majorly, the investors, similar jurisdictions, so it's mature markets. And if we're relying on mitigation of our climate issues, again, on these technologies, we're leaving least developed countries behind. So where least developed countries can really play a role is in nature-based solutions. And again, if we don't fix the carbon markets problem, and if we don't fix the requirements around nature-based solutions, then we leave them behind. So just, I think what's also important to mention is, it's not only, like you said, we have very little finances in adaptation, and nature-based solutions are actually both mitigation and climate adaptation mechanisms. So that's why, beyond instruments, we also need to look at this holistically and look at policy as well when we speak about inclusive green finance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for unpacking that and sharing in more depth. So, Paul, I wanted to go over to you because you said at the beginning about your gender funding, the research, you're doing on the gender funding gap in Southeast Asia, and I think we can't talk about climate, especially in this region, without talking about the issues in that gap. So I would love for you to share a little bit about what you've unpacked so far, what insights have emerged, and what changes you think we need to see to actually see that gap closing.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's a great question. I think it actually relates really closely with some of the points that Holly and Kristina brought up as well. So I think, not to get too self-promotional, but I think when we started the Radical Fund, so we are a climate fund, but we actually have there's a sort of undercurrent of a gender lens. I don't want to say a gender lens angle because we're not formally a gender lens fund, but we have a very strong preference to seeing women in climate tech and in our portfolio. And I think a lot of the reason is, one, economically, there's that very firm belief that gender diversity in the startup space is economically valuable. We feel that mixed gender teams actually do perform quite well. A lot of the evidence shows that they tend to outperform all male teams on average. But why we specifically looked at gender within the context of our climate investment is the fact that negative climate impacts disproportionately fall on lower socioeconomic classes. That's why we're talking about loss and damage. That's why there's worry about that tension between the global north and global south. Now, if we look at who is suffering within that population, the lower socioeconomic classes are disproportionately women and children. So if you want to try and solve and alleviate climate problems, women need to be both part of the solution in devising the solutions, and they need to be the stakeholders as beneficiaries of the solution. So it's that whole point when you got a bunch of tech bros in Silicon Valley trying to solve Silicon Valley climate problems, that addresses, 10% of the population and ignores the other 90%. So for me, a lot of my work it's not two separate spheres. It's sort of worrying about the climate impacts and also thinking about the gender impacts. I think on a general side, and I'm still doing the research, so I probably have more questions out there than actual answers, but the conclusion still holds is that gender diversity in the startup space is a good thing. It's not just a moral imperative, it is an economically valuable thing. Academic research shows it. Actually, a lot of the work that I did in my previous VC fund, where we actually did have, we had gender lens initiatives as well. We saw that mixed gender teams basically experienced better traction, better talent retention, faster time to raise up rounds, and it just arrived at better decision making. And then a lot of the work that I did in my first fund, where I had the privilege of actually launching and running a corporate VC fund. For me, I had a situation over 4 years where half of the people that came through my team, exactly 50% of everyone that came through my team, was female. At a time when there were almost no senior level women in VC in Thailand, many of the partner, quite a significant number of the partner level women in Thailand VC came through my team. and they're doing some pretty amazing things. And on top of all that, the fund return was amazing. And I claim no credit for that. I just gave a platform for women, and they basically found some amazing investments and kicked ass. And so I think there's that opportunity to say, how can, and again, it's not a question of women being better than men, men being better than women. It's that sort of creative platform of bringing different perspectives and ideas where you get better investment decision making. You get more creative business models ideas on the startup side. And so I think, because, there tends to be a greater number of women on the impact side and not the grassroots level side. If we want to be more inclusive and if we want to solve for adaptation problems, the women can't just be the stakeholders. We need to tap, women like Holly who are directly interacting and who can have a direct read on the types of problems that we're going to solve, the technologies that will or won't work, the business models that will or won't work. And so, I think in our space, I think one of the things that we say at Radical is that you can't solve the climate problem if you don't solve the gender problem.
I love that. Definitely going to take that. That's really, really great summary there. So now getting a little bit more granular, Holly, and I will be opening up for Q&A after this question, so you can have a think about questions for our wonderful panel. But Holly, financial activism is a really big part and it's very central to your work. So in your view, what can individuals sort of do to help advance the green finance conversation and action in the region?
Yes. I think there is so much power in the average person that we don't realize, because I say financial literacy and political literacy are the two biggest things that can change the world. It can change your world, but it can change your local world as well as our big blue and green world. So becoming more financially literate and becoming more politically literate are the two most important things that anybody can do. How you can participate in improving green finance, in advancing green finance, and specifically the inclusive element, is to engage. So I write this article, 10 Tools of a Financial Activist, and it's everything from charity to investment and everything that's in between, boycotts, your workplace, I don't know what else, like your spending, these kind of things. And whenever you think about areas of money, actually I say we have three currencies of life, and it's your time, energy, and money. All of them could be put towards things that give you financial return or impact return in your life. It's true. Impact investing can be a philosophy for life. But the point is to engage, to properly think. Not blindly chuck your money places, not shop without thinking about the consequences. You can't be perfect. You can't have absolute positive impact on the world, but you can be conscious. You can be a conscious consumer. There are loads of companies and NGOs that are doing all the due diligence and research for you. So you don't have to dig deep into your portfolio or into your pension, because somebody's already done that for you. So there are loads of things on the internet if you simply search the thing that you care about, and search like index for, and then this value. So like index for animal friendly or cruelty free investing, or I care about campaign finance and I don't want my spending or my investments to be contributing to essentially lobbying in the US. Campaign finance is slightly different, but similar concept. Well, Goods Unite Us is an example of an organization that gives you that data for free. So there's loads of things as an individual you can do, and to empower yourself for that. But key, engage. Engage with what's happening in your life, but learn. So I'll just quickly summarize before we do Q&A. Before I moved to Singapore, I knew I wanted to work in Asia, and I knew I wanted to put my youngest, most energetic years in a place in the world where I felt I could make a difference. But before I got here, I made sure that I lived on the ground in South and Southeast Asia for a whole year. And I didn't work. I did pro bono, I did volunteering, I did living and listening and learning, because you can't just go around being like, this is how we should do it, when you know nothing about that area of climate or that area in the world. So even just education, speaking to people. If you decide you really care about gender equality and you've got a soft spot for Indonesia, speak to some Indonesian women. Talk to people who are serving the Indonesian women community. Learn from them, listen, and be led by those that you're trying to champion.
Great, some great action points.
Can I make one comment?
Yeah.
Because I thought your mention about financial and political literacy is really on spot, and it reminded me of a quote which I can't remember exactly, so I'll paraphrase. But there's a climate economist out of Yale, William Nordhaus, and I think he was nominated for a Nobel Prize at one point. But he'd commented that solving the climate problem is not an issue about technology, because the technology all exists today. We don't even need to worry about CCUS and pie in the sky, like it'll solve it in the future. We could solve the problems today. It is not a technology issue. It is an economic and politics issue. It is the willingness to create financial incentives and disincentives to change behavior, and it's having the political will to implement them. So, you know, when I think about climate tech, and I talk to a lot of people saying, I'm not a technologist, I'm not an engineer. It's not a technology problem. You know, it's good to invest in technology, but it's really thinking about the financial literacy and the political literacy. And so, you know, I think that's why, you know, it's awesome when I see so many people from different disciplines tackling this problem, because it's not all about the technologists.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you. Who has our first question?
Hey, thank you. I think it's rare when I see 4 favorite people on the stage, so thank you for bringing them together. My question is for Holly. Holly, at the point in time when you liked something about the question, you mentioned some things have to change in the model and some things have to change right here, right now. Could you just go over that concept? Because I was just listening to what you said, but I didn't get the concept. You were talking about models. What exactly did you mean by models?
Are you referring to deployment of capital, like financial models? Yeah, okay. So the companies that I choose to work for are offering something that I want. I first joined a fintech startup that made an impact investing app for retail investors. I was like, wonderful. I've been looking for this. I'll help you make it. It didn't exist before that. It was in a US company, and there were a couple in Europe and UK as well, but they weren't even competitors. We were all friends because we were all trying to give this to our regional clients. The companies I work for now are the same. Like they're not unicorns. They're just simply one of the first people to say, hey, like we're all struggling with this as retail investors, and actually on the other side, these companies are struggling to get funding. So this idea of the missing middle is that startups, they get funding at a certain stage, like pre-seed to A, and if they manage to fit the VC model, and then obviously there's all the ones that don't, and then they die in the valley of death. They couldn't make it past that first bit, but they also couldn't afford to give more shares of their company away. They wanted to retain control, and there aren't enough accessible and unique financial vehicles for what they needed. So particularly in bridging finance, where they just needed something to tie them over to this bit. They didn't need like another $1 million or thousands of dollars in investment. They just needed like a couple hundred to cover the cost of a van or extra 6 months of tech development, because software development always, they say times 2 add 10 as how many months you think it will actually last for. But that's what I mean is more things like a loan, more things like a grant plus a fractional CFO, you know, things that they need to create sustainability, not non-green sustainability, like sustainability to sustain finance. Because sometimes with MSMEs or community initiatives, it's not for lack of impact in their solution. It can be lack of business know-how, because they never planned to be a business. They were just solving a real problem that they had that day. And then, actually that problem's not going away because it's climate change and it's getting worse all the time. So supporting them in different ways, especially with the mentorship or skill building element, which, sorry, I'll round up this last point. It taps into the element of why it needs to be inclusive, because when you have those non-traditional MSMEs, they can't access like bank loans. That's why we need these impact loans. They can't necessarily access credit. Maybe they have informal business practices. Maybe their paperwork isn't up to scratch, or maybe it's not up to the standard that a bank wants to see. But it could be a business that's operated for like 4 or 5 generations forever, and it's just now because of a flood, like I said, easy example, or a wildfire, they need a loan. For the first time, they've been profitable, operational for like 4 generations, and now they need a loan. But what to do? It's a financial institution. It has to meet specific risk mitigation. But impact loans look at the bigger picture often, and you can decide how much you want to push on the impact versus the finance, et cetera, et cetera. But tailoring these solutions to actually what the pain points are is ultimately what I'm trying to advocate for. Yeah.
So I would love for each of you to just share one action point that you would like or encourage everyone in the room to do. And Paul, we'll start with you.
Oh, okay. I need to think about that.
Okay, then we'll reverse. Holly, you go first.
Educate yourself, whether it's financial literacy and political literacy, or if it's simply understanding the position that you hold in a room, in your regional or local world, and then you will be able to make more informed deployment of capital that is inclusive.
Okay, Kristina.
I'm going to add to a lot of what you said, but from the niche financial angle. So you don't have to be an investor, you don't have to be a regulator and so on to take action specifically on your finances. Your personal finances matter, because even where you keep your money, which bank your savings account is, matters. Because like Holly said, there's a lot of data out there where you can check how well they perform on specific science-based studies. And it matters because what banks do is they aggregate all of the retail money, and then they put that into corporate loans that can be trickled down to deforestation-related projects or fossil fuels. So that's extremely important. And there are things like, WWF actually has a screening framework. There's Make My Money Matter in the UK, which is related to pension funds. There's My Fair Money in Europe as well, that's related to funds, sustainable funds. So there's a lot of data and information, but even, you don't have to be an investor again, even where you keep your savings account or which pension you choose can save or actually can add to the problem.
I'm also going to build on Holly's point, and I'm going to say it's not even just educate yourself. Learn an aspect about climate that you didn't know about before. Because the one thing I learned when I went down this rabbit hole is that climate is incredibly broad and incredibly complex. It's a systems problem. And so if you know a lot about NBS or carbon, then basically read books on soil health, read books on water cycles. If you know about that, read books on mining. Understand the entire ecological cycle, because it's one of those things that sometimes solving the climate crisis is like playing whack-a-mole. You knock down one mole and another one pops up. It's like you never. The issue about climate is you never know about what the unintended consequences is. Which is why something like terraforming or whatever, you're trying to change the atmosphere. You never know what you're going to unleash. So I imagine everyone is very well versed on climate or specific areas, but always look for that area that it's like, oh, we hadn't thought about heat or water or soil. For me, it's like every month it's a different book. Like, wow, I had no idea. Yeah.
Exactly. We don't know what we don't know, and knowledge is power. So I just want to take a moment to thank each of you for sharing so much with us today. I definitely walked away learning a lot. Let's give them a round of applause.